Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us for the final week of our course, Propaganda and Protest. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Gregory Williams.
Good morning. First of all, thanks so much to Kristen and Elizabeth for organizing this and for inviting me to offer you some thoughts today on what are actually quite recent works. That's what I'm going to focus on today. I realize you've heard a number of talks associated broadly with themes of protest and propaganda in the visual arts stemming from this postcard exhibition. What we thought we'd do today is bring it a little bit closer to the present. And in putting this talk together, one of the things I thought about as I was organizing the images was this work, which is in the MFA collection, and which, if you received, I hope, did the handouts go around? Okay, great. You'll see a couple of images of this work of art in use. Amalia Pica's Now Speak, as you can see, was made in 2011. It's significant for this institution in a specific way. When it was purchased in 2013, it was the first work of performance-related art that the museum acquired for its collection. And it's an interesting thing to think about because performance in the visual arts has a very long history, of course in the United States, but around the world, that can be traced back in its more modern forms, at least as early as the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You can think of kind of cabaret activities. You can think of the futurist actions and performances, the Dada readings, spoken word events, and then right on up through the sort of explosive years of performance art in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and right on up to the present. But it's interesting, too, to think that this object, this very static and rather heavy object in cast concrete, stands in for the field of performance. But it does so for a good reason, because this work always sort of begs to be activated. On its own, it looks a little bit like minimalist sculpture. It's got very clear structure, made out of very legible kind of industrial materials. It has that kind of emphasis on the transparency of construction. You can really understand how it was put together, that the minimalists prized in the 60s and 70s. But of course, the way this work is meant to function is in practice. It's meant to be activated by people, and that's really one of the themes we're going to be dealing with today. What got me thinking, too, about how best to approach this topic, which is admittedly vast, I've decided to focus my remarks just on the context of the United States today, just to keep things a bit reined in. But I think, as many of you know, if you've been reading about contemporary art and its relationship with art institutions, especially in the last 6, 7, or 8 years, you'll know that this relationship has often been quite fraught and contested. And so what I'm doing today is showing you a number of works with an emphasis on art produced since 2011, so very recent projects, but then moving us back at various moments to the 60s and to the 1980s and the 70s to see what kinds of more recent historical precursors we might look at. So all within the kind of broader framework of contemporary art, but I wanted to really emphasize more recent activities and discussions, debates, and you could also say in some instances outright controversies that have been emotional, that have been in many cases quite unresolved, and in other cases have actually led to some, I think what most participants in the debate might agree were very productive kinds of exchanges. And so we'll be looking at works that kind of run the gamut. This is the image you're looking at here is the way in which this object, and this is a topic I also want to think about, both kind of needs the institution to give it a sort of clear frame, to obviously take care of it, to have it exist as part of a larger collection, but which in some ways also doesn't need the institution because the object can function out in public space. It's a work that you could just as easily install in a park or in some other public context, in a plaza. You'd have to anchor it to the earth probably, although it would be hard to steal because I imagine it's rather heavy. I don't know the weight. But it's certainly a work that does quite well within the interior spaces of the museum, and it would function very well outside. As you can see on the left, what you're looking at here are some members of the Teen Arts Council at the MFA as one of the many activations of this work where students, and in this case students and then all members of the public, people who were invited, have been able to use this and use it as an actual platform from which to deliver remarks. And as some of you have maybe even seen this in action, it was on view for quite a while in a show about a year and a half ago, I think, called Political Intent, which took a number of works from the MFA's collection that deal explicitly with political content and put them into a relationship with each other. And that's what you're seeing on the lower right there. That is just one of many speakers who took advantage of the podium. Some of them gave impromptu speeches, spoke extemporaneously, whereas others read from a set of pre-printed texts that came from famous speeches and famous protest movements and events from history. Amalia Pica has a nice phrase here, and this is taken right from the MFA website, about what her work is meant to do. And she says, quote, "I'm interested in what brings us together. And so communication and its difficulties are for me a sign of how much we need each other," end quote. And I want to think about this idea of this sometimes quite contentious, you might even say love-hate relationship between artists and the institutions that support them, that exhibit their work, and hopefully also collect and maintain it. By and large, it is a productive, very fruitful relationship, but at times, and I would say in the recent past, that relationship has really been pretty seriously challenged. And so I'm going to show you a range of works across this spectrum. So first, to kind of think a little bit about the type of object that I'm describing here by Amalia Pica, and a kind of prehistory of the work of art that exists inside and outside of the institution simultaneously. I could show you many different works that emerged in the 60s to make this point, but this is a really relevant one and one that some of you may well be familiar with. The French artist Daniel Buren started making works like this in the mid-1960s in Paris. And his Peinture, Manifestation 3 of 1967, exists both in its materiality and in the way it's exhibited and deployed as both equally within and outside of the museum or the gallery. It simply consists of a bolt of pre-printed fabric, striped fabric that he bought, he purchased, he cut at a certain length to make a square, 2.5 meters each side. And then to indicate that it was actually a painting, on the right and on the left sides of this image, he actually applied acrylic paint to vertical stripes of white so that it could effectively qualify officially as a painting because it actually has paint applied to its surface. Later on, he'd give that up because he'd realized it wasn't absolutely necessary to convey his ideas. But what he did with this was he thought this could function in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, it fits right into the history of geometric abstraction within modernist painting of the 20th century. It has a clear pattern of alternating red and white vertical stripes. And thus, you could say it's an abstract painting within a particular kind of lineage. But it's also very much of the everyday kind of ordinary outside world in that this type of fabric was the kind of material used by French cafes for their awnings to cover and protect customers at outside tables from the elements. And so he wants to be read in both of these ways simultaneously. It exists in these two spheres, in the more exalted, protected spaces of the museum, but also in spaces out in public. And so he came up with this kind of baseline image that then allowed him to create all kinds of other works utilizing this striped motif, this sort of abstract object. Here in the midst of the May protests of 1968, and Daniel Buran was involved in that process and put a number of these works out into public space during this time. Essentially, he wanted to think about what happens when the object, the image, the work of abstract painting leaves the institution and finds its way onto the street. So for this action you're looking at here, he hired a couple of people to wear these kind of homemade sandwich board signs on these backpacks. And they were marching here back and forth in front of the Museum of Modern Art in Paris as a way of saying the work is attached sort of still to the museum, but it exists also outside. It has a place on the street, and to kind of visualize this idea of being inside and outside simultaneously. He would continue to do that in various ways. This is an exhibition he had in New York in 1973 at the John Weber Gallery, and this is in Soho on West Broadway, looking north. And what you're seeing here is an image of these objects that span across the street. They're on a wire that moves from the gallery, which is in one of the windows on the left side of the street. This kind of clothing line of paintings, which of course resembles or calls to mind the laundry hanging out to dry across tenement buildings and across or just kind of nostalgic images of New York City, cuts right through the open window of the gallery space and then runs through the exhibition space at the same time, so it simultaneously exists inside and outside. Now, that's just a kind of, that's the general frame, this idea of the work of art having a relationship with the institution as a physical space, but a relationship that is always kind of pushing against that, of that arrangement of being situated, of being sited in the museum. In some ways, you might think of trying to escape a little bit, of avoiding a feeling of being trapped in those spaces. This would lead to a whole range of other works. We talked today about this type of work in art history classes, and starting in the 1980s, people started using the phrase institutional critique as a kind of blanket term to describe works by people like Buran, Marcel Brodars, a number of other artists who emerged in the late 60s. Hans Haacke, some of you may be familiar with. He's shown his work here in the Boston area in the last several years, all of whom were interested in thinking about the museum as a kind of frame and understanding that the work of art doesn't just exist in this kind of space of isolation. It's implicated in all kinds of other relationships, financial, political, social, emotional, ethical. These kinds of relationships, of course, extend beyond the walls of the museum. And that's precisely what artists have pushed and worked on over the last several decades, and leading right on up to the present. If you jump forward about 14 years, another exhibition, I think, makes that idea of the porousness, the permeability of the museum architecture quite explicit. This is a project by the collective known as Grand Fury, which emerged out of the protest movement associated with the AIDS epidemic in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s. They were associated with ACT UP, the group founded in 1987, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was a group of people from all walks of life, different occupations, different backgrounds, all of whom were concerned about what they felt was a completely inadequate government and corporate response to this crisis, in which people in their community were dying, especially by 1987 in great numbers. This project was done in the window, what we think of sort of display windows from the new museum when it used to be on Broadway, just below Houston Street in Manhattan before, of course, if some of you know the new museum now on the Bowery in its new building, but this is where it was when it first started out. And what you're looking at here are these display windows. You can see to the right the entrance. It's closed up at this hour when the photograph was taken. This was taken at night. And then you have this bay to the left where the installation was situated. This is, of course, an old department store. It's an old building. These bays were always meant for street display of products. But instead of showing works of art for sale, or any kind of other commodity for sale, this was an installation that was meant to speak to the widest audience possible. Here what you have is a reference to the present through the lens of history. And so up top, you have the silence equals death sign that another subgroup associated with ACT UP and with Grand Fury, the Silence Equals Death Project. They came up with this slogan to speak to this idea. Inactivity essentially condemns people to die. And so silence equals death, they produced in the form of a neon sign that you see on the upper left, as well as posters, all of which were also, the phrase is associated with the pink triangle, the symbol that the Nazis used to mark gay and lesbian people during the 1930s and 40s. And so you have here on the left that historical reference already in the symbol, which is then made more explicit in the image below, which is a scene, as some of you may have recognized from the trials at Nuremberg in the aftermath of World War II, where the Nazi higher-ups were called to account for the atrocities they committed. And so with that photograph in the background, they create a relationship between the immediate aftermath of World War II and this idea of historical culpability, legal culpability, and put that into a relationship with people in the present. And so you can just see, we don't have the best images from this installation, but you can see three silhouettes in front next to the figure that's lit up. The silhouettes each represent a figure from the 1980s, and they are in turn illuminated by a lamp above, and you can just see the one shining down on the figure on the right, and the lights would go off and on a timed sequence. On the right is one of the figures they were from the present day that they were highlighting, and this is William F. Buckley, the columnist, the conservative columnist. Each of these figures who was lit up had a board or a surface in front of them on which one of their statements was written. It included a doctor who had said he would be unwilling to treat AIDS patients. It had people who attacked them for religious reasons. In the case of William F. Buckley, he famously suggested that AIDS patients be tattooed in order for people sufferers of HIV/AIDS, they should be tattooed so that people could recognize them. And so this was a very obvious statement of a kind of harsh, unforgiving, and really quite ethically problematic, to say the least, approach to the matter. And of course, that idea of tattooing links in a very direct way to the history of the Holocaust and the people sent to the concentration camp. So it was very loaded, very impactful work, and it was part of a larger body of work that Grand Fury was involved with that you could call outright propaganda, and that sort of brings us back to that theme. These are just three examples of works that they produced during these years. And what needs to be said here, and this speaks to some of the works we're going to look at in a moment, is there was a conscious decision by the members of this group to operate in the form of a collective rather than as individuals. The members of Grand Fury were trained in the visual arts, they were trained in graphic design, and so they had a very strong visual sensibility. And so they were primed in a way to create strong images with strong textual messages attached to them. And they talked at the time about very deliberately essentially putting their art careers on hold in favor of making work that had a powerful message because of the severity of the crisis they and their community were dealing with. And so you have the Read My Lips image there. I'm sure many of you will recognize that as a reference to George Bush Sr. Of course, he was saying, read my lips, no new taxes, but they turned that around and put it into the context of how AIDS, myths about how AIDS was spread at this time. Or on the top, kissing Kissing Doesn't Kill, related message. Greed and Indifference Do. That one, in their case, is riffing on a series of ads by the Benetton company. Here they have interracial couple and two same-sex couples to emphasize the community that they were part of and responding to, but also to speak to the idea of to combat ideas of more kind of heteronormative, restrictive expectations for love and for sex. And so what you see here is a large-scale print that was placed on the sides of buses, around dozens of buses that traveled around New York City, and they took it out as an ad, so this was seen by a lot of people. Now that's really one of the key themes here too, is the question of audience. Who is looking at this work, how wide of an audience is reached. You can say this one factors into that conversation as well. This was visible to everybody walking by on the street. And so one of the things that happens in this history of artists moving outside of the institution is the idea of expanding their audience and really speaking to people who have no connection with the visual arts as part of their daily lives. These figures were also influenced themselves by historical precedent. The members of Grand Fury created this famous poster on the left, "The Government Has Blood on its Hands," this in 1988, one AIDS death every half hour. That was the average of a number of people dying at the time. And with this very clear graphic image using black, white, and red colors that really hit the human eye as directly as possible. They themselves, not unlike their reference back to World War II in the New Museum Project, were very aware of earlier forms of agitation and political protest from the 1930s. And here is a figure they were quite interested in, the German artist John Hartfield, who anglicized his name after he went into exile from the Nazis, and made works in exile that attacked the regime. And this as early as 1935, just 2 years after they came to power. And you see this is the history of photo montage, where you take an existing image and cut and paste other images onto the surface to create a new one. And what you have here is a kind of prototypical German family of the era replacing their regular foodstuffs with armaments and with iron and with metal, based on a famous quote at the time by Goering, one of Hitler's main henchmen. And the quote is essentially, "Hooray, the butter is all gone," and so they can eat these other products, based on a quote from a speech that Goering had given not long before, in which he says, "Iron has always made the empire strong. Butter and lard have only made people fat." And so this part of this, a critique of the process of rearmament under the Nazis in the mid-1930s, and this very rapidly increasing militarism at the time. Now, this is also taking place in the context, Grand Fury's work, I should say, in 1988, just at the beginnings of what would come to be known in the early 90s as the culture wars. And I think, when I teach this to my undergraduate students, it's really interesting because they know the term, but they don't necessarily know when it came about. I imagine many of you were around and remember the debates right in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., not only about the appropriateness of certain kinds of images, but in particular about the government's funding, the use of taxpayer dollars to fund works by artists that the members of the government, particularly members of the Senate, found controversial, found blasphemous, or of dubious ethical origin. And so if we think about the work of someone like Robert Mapplethorpe today, it's virtually impossible to decouple it from that moment in the late 80s where his work really became the flashpoint for what the press pretty quickly deemed the culture wars, where I think some of the partisan split that we see so entrenched in our current political climate first really manifested not the first time in history, but manifested in a way that I think feels familiar in the current moment, bringing up issues of censorship, for instance. And so this is just one work out of very many I could have chosen by Mapplethorpe. This is him in the late 1970s, two men kissing. There were other works that particularly the senator from North Carolina, Jesse Helms, was very up in arms about and felt that were a sign, or even you might say a symptom, of the decline of American culture. And William Bennett, the education secretary under Reagan, had written extensively about this, the idea that we were a culture in decline because we no longer had values that everyone could share. And so this, by the way, just incidentally, I read just before I entered the room just now that there's an announcement for a new show at the Guggenheim opening in January, a two-part show dealing with the legacy of Robert Mapplethorpe. The first part's going to have works from their collection. They have a very extensive collection of his work, so it'll be a focus on Mapplethorpe, followed by a show that's going to track his legacy among contemporary artists of the next generation. And so if you're going to New York in the spring, I recommend seeing that. I think it's a particularly interesting time to look back at the legacy of Mapplethorpe, given that he died of AIDS-related causes right at the moment where his work was becoming the flashpoint for all of these debates. To remind us, that happened in 1989. His traveling exhibition, which had already been in Philadelphia, was on its way to the Corcoran Gallery in D.C., and that was where things got really complicated because senators did not like the idea of a show that was supported by the NEA, by the National Endowment for the Arts, in other words, by taxpayer dollars, that would come and be situated so centrally in the national capital. And so, in fact, the pressure from the senators, which included threats to defund the Corcoran, became so pronounced that the director felt it was best to cancel the show. And so it was an effective act of censorship during those years. There were different outcomes at different exhibition spaces, but that's for another lecture. But just to take us to the other key figure from this period, this is, of course, the work that many of you also might remember. I think what's remarkable about this time, aside from the fact that we really saw how divided in many ways the populace and our political culture was in this country, but what really shocked people at the time, it was one thing to see Mapplethorpe's work generating this controversy, because by '89 he had become quite visible and he had this major retrospective traveling. But Andres Serrano no one really knew him at this time outside of New York City. He was a young artist. He was part of a traveling group exhibition, so it was just a few of his works in this show. And the show was actually traveling through states in the American South, and it was partly through conservative activists who had seen the work there and felt offended by it that the information actually got to senators, in particular to Alphonse D'Amato from New York, who, just as Jesse Helms had held up an image by Mapplethorpe on the Senate floor, so too did Alphonse D'Amato hold up an image of this, the famous Piss Christ, in which Andres Serrano submerged a cheap plastic crucifix in a container of his own urine and took a photograph of it and then blew the photograph up. It's just amazing to imagine a work of art by a relatively unknown New York artist being waved around on the Senate floor as a sign of the degradation of American culture at the time. Serrano, I should say, for his part, denied that it was an attack on Christianity or an attack on anyone else's religion. He claimed, and one can decide whether he was being disingenuous or serious, but he said he had grown up Catholic himself in New York, and this was a criticism of the cheapening of religion through commercialization. So he had deliberately bought this cheap plastic crucifixion. It also became quite a beautiful image. Somewhere in there, the aesthetic quality, of course, also needs to be taken into account. So with that, I want to turn now to more recent works which continue along these themes of controversy and protest. And we can think also about ideas of propaganda as we go along. So from here on out, I'm focusing mostly on works produced since 2011. And of course, one of the reasons for that is that 2011 marks a key moment, and that is for the visual arts, that is the association with artists, between artists and the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement, which took place in Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan in the fall of 2011, spawned a number of different offshoots. One of them was Occupy museums, and to this day the term occupy is being used as a verb, but also as a noun to name different types of organizations associated with protest and activism. This is just one among many signs produced by the Occupy Museums movement, and that you can see their mandate is quite large: protecting the earth, water, and sky as art, and organizing against fascism is the best kind of art. I think it's kind of deliberately overarching and provocative, and maybe even a little bit humorous, but the idea is that they see themselves as operating again under this mantle of a group rather than explicitly as individuals, which links them, I think, to the Grand Fury group. Now, in 2014, the members of Occupy Museums teamed up. In fact, you even see they were using here the OWS, or Occupy Wall Street Illuminator, which was a mobile projector that was driven around during the fall of 2011. It was situated in different locations in the Wall Street area in order to project messages onto buildings. And this is something that artists have been doing for quite some time. GULF stands for Global Ultra Luxury Faction. And this is a group that was formed in conjunction with the Occupy Museums group as a way to bring attention, and this is something that's also been going on since the 1960s, to bring attention to the relationship between the museum institution and the outside world of financial speculation, global labor practices, all in the context here of the Guggenheim building a new institution in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. And so what transpired was, and there's multiple headings. I won't go into all of the minutiae because there are a lot of different groups involved in all of this, and it would take too much time to parse all of their various names and the individual members of the group. But the upshot is that they came together in order to draw attention to what they felt was the Guggenheim's involvement in unfair labor practices in the building of this Frank Gehry designed museum that's still has not yet opened in Abu Dhabi. And so this protest action involved them parking their van in front of the Guggenheim in New York and projecting this image, 1% museum, speaking, of course, to this idea of the divide between the 99 and the 1%, a relationship that was really first established through the Occupy movement, something that has really found its way into the common speech, everyday speech patterns of Americans, and particularly of the political left in this country. This is itself not a new thing to be projecting onto buildings. This is something that goes back at least into the 1980s. Krzysztof Wodiszko, I hear he spoke here just last night, so this is somebody who has a long-running connection to Boston and Cambridge in particular. He was director of the Center for Advanced Visual Studies in the Arts at MIT for many years, and has a public artwork as part of the still relatively young police headquarters and emergency services center in Cambridge, just across the river. This is a project he produced in late 1988 in the context of the presidential election at that time. And so for, I think, 3 nights just before the early November election, where George Bush Sr. was running against Michael Dukakis, he projected this image onto the surface of the Hirshhorn Museum. In this case, we're talking about a work that was done with permission. The museum, they asked him to do this, or they worked with him as part of this project. That wasn't the case here. This was more of what you might think of as a kind of guerrilla action, where they just drove up with no announcement. And there was an interesting quote I read by one of the key members of this group, Noah Fisher. He was one of the founders of Occupy Museums, saying that they were shocked by how easy it was to do. And how nobody bothered them. And his assumption was that when you're projecting onto an art building, people read it as art rather than as a different form of more overt political protest. And apparently they were blocking a lane and waving cars by, and police cars and cabs and ambulances were going about their business, and nobody really batted an eye. I think that's also a function of them being in New York City. But there are these distinctions, and they are for each individual context, of course, they can be quite important. Now, Wadishko here had permission. The image he chose here was that of the hands of a putative presidential candidate in front of a lectern giving a press statement, presumably. One hand, a candle, a lit candle speaking to wisdom and rationality, and in the other, a gun, which was meant to evoke this debate, the famous Willie Horton debate between Bush and Dukakis, these ads that Bush took out attacking Dukakis as being soft on crime, where crime became, and who's the more serious anti-crime fighter, that became one of the key themes of this moment. Here I have a little GIF so you can see what it looked like. That was the other thing they were projecting. So they had the still image of the 1%, and then art is not luxury was something they emphasized in the process of critiquing what they felt were the unfair labor practices of this moment. Now, this just a couple of weeks later, this was February of 2014, a couple of weeks later, they produced an action inside the museum. So once again, dealing with this idea of operating in both realms, having a relationship with the inside, but also being on the street. And these are just two of many actions they've taken. This global ultra luxury faction, again, produced a work. This, obviously, the large bill you're seeing there has been superimposed digitally. That's not, they didn't capture that as it fell from the ceiling or from the aisles, the ramp rather. What you're looking at, this took place, and this was obviously a very deliberate decision, around 6:45 p.m. on a Saturday night, when in the evening the museum has free entry, and it's hugely popular. It's packed at this time. There's always by then a line out the door of people who want to get in. So they deliberately picked it at its most full, and at the appointed time, somebody downstairs, a member of their group, rang a chime, and people who had dispersed themselves, members of Gulf, had dispersed themselves up the ramp and then dropped down hundreds of these parodic, these mock, what they called 1% bills. So rather than $1 bills, they were 1%. You can, I think, you can make that out, I think. And it says speculative global museum on the top and no sustainable cultural value on the bottom. And these they fell all over the place. People raced to pick them up, to collect them. The guards were caught unawares, and as the story goes, they didn't arrest anyone, but they did do an interesting thing, which was to stop allowing people to take photographs. So some of the photographs here that you're looking at were done right at the start, and then according to the accounts from the event, they shut off the photography, and then eventually kicked everybody out and closed early. So it effectively shut it down maybe about an hour and a half early. But they got their point across. And I should add to this that the Guggenheim has been in active negotiations with members of Gulf and other groups who are concerned about the treatment of workers building this museum. Most of these workers in Abu Dhabi are migrant workers coming from other countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan. And there have been multiple reports of their living conditions and certainly their working conditions being unsafe and very uncomfortable. The Guggenheim, for its part, has engaged with them actively. They've made numerous statements and have essentially said that some of the accusations on the part of the artists are incorrect, are excessive. And so where Noah Fisher, one of the key members of Occupy Museums, can say, we're interested in working with the Guggenheim and its architecture as a site to bring consciousness about the issues because the Guggenheim uses its celebratory architecture in a very specific way as a branding. So we're rebranding the architecture. It's interesting, too, to think about the museum itself as an object that can be taken as a kind of discrete entity and effectively repositioned through these actions. The Guggenheim, for their part, I think it's only fair to read their response, and this is one of many they wrote. As global citizens, we share the concerns about human rights and fair labor practices and continue to be committed to making progress on the issues. They do point out some important facts. At the same time, it is important to clarify that the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi is not currently under construction, despite erroneous claims by certain protesters, and they go on to kind of lay out the more contemporary specifics. I've seen some follow-up discussion and read some follow-up accounts by members of Gulf, and it seems to be at a little bit of a deadlock, these negotiations, and yet the idea, I think, that's important as the takeaway is that the artists feel that this institution is as much their institution as it is the institution of the directors, the board of trustees, the curators, that it's a shared space, it's a public good, and for that reason, they feel that they have the right to call it out when they feel that it's not behaving well. And so these protests have been more or less contentious, but they have been part of a larger process of very active public engagement with museums, which of course has forced museums to really rethink all kinds of messaging issues, ideas around PR. How do we save face? How do we put a positive spin on the situation? How do we engage these people in a way that's actually fruitful for us? And how do we correct some misperceptions? What's been interesting, of course, in all of this is one of the big discussions around institutional critique as a concept is to kind of correct the idea, the misperception that in order to level a proper institutionally driven critique, you have to exist fully outside of the institution. You can only exist, you have to give an objective, distanced response to one of these museums or galleries or alternative spaces. But what came out of a lot of the discourse around institutional critique in the 80s and right on up to the present, promoted by the writings of people like Andrea Fraser, herself an artist who has interacted a lot with institutions in a kind of this critical way, is to say you can never get out of the institution. Everybody is implicated in these spaces, certainly artists, and so it's best to understand them as places that represent you and that you feel a sense of direct connection to. And that what we've seen, though, is one way that the museum deals with these criticisms or even outright attacks, of course, is to try to fold them into their process. And so one way of doing that is to simply invite the artists to do shows inside and to claim the work as part of their programming. And that's functioned on a lot of different levels over the last several decades. This is an installation at the 2017 Whitney Biennial, so just last year, a biennial that had a couple of controversies in it, one of which we'll talk about in a sec. One subgroup of Occupy Museums calls itself Debt Fair, and its objective is to draw attention to the indebtedness of many visual artists who take on enormous debts as many of them have to foot the bill for their MFA programs. Some of them coming away with $100,000 in debt after 2 or 3 years of study, and that has become a real common problem for visual artists, many of whom will not be able to support themselves from their work. And so this is an installation that was part of the Whitney Biennial, so obviously they were invited by the curators of this show to come in and display their current project. And what you have here is a large wall that's been cut into, so the sheetrock has been opened up to expose the metal struts holding this wall together. So this is not a part of the permanent in architecture. This is a wall that cuts through the middle of the space. And inside that cut are a number of artworks by artists who all have debt for their college educations, for their MFA programs, or maybe even for their BFA programs. Debt that is owned by various subsidiaries of the firm BlackRock. And so what you have here are artists who can deliberately pinpoint the amount of money that they owe and that is held and is churning out profit for these various financial units. And they have a system here where what you're looking at are two graph lines. The lower one is the value of works in the art market, which goes up and down but doesn't rise too consistently. And the blue line is the profits for the firm BlackRock across time, and watching it rise as the artists are not being compensated equally. And there are more elements to this, one of which is that the works on view here are for sale, or were for sale. And there was a complex pricing mechanism where, and I don't fully understand it, but I think what they did was they came up with a way of determining a price based on the amount of debt that each individual artist owed to, again, one of these subsidiaries of BlackRock. And I don't know how many were actually sold. But this idea of this, what I'm leading to is to think about sort of categories that we can think about independently in these years, about the last 7 or 8 years. The first of which, of course, has a lot to do with class and in the economy. So that's what we've been looking at. And here's, on the left, just another view of that wall. And then one of many printed materials that they produce. Of course, a big part of the production of many of these collectives is printed matter, is information. And it's presented sometimes in visually compelling ways and sometimes, as here, just in a fairly direct way. This just describes how much debt all the people that are involved in this particular project hold. And it's a collective debt of a little under $6 million. If you go to the Debt Fair website, they have their own website. They say, and I gather this is in the United States, but total artist debt at the moment is a little under $55 million. Just to emphasize the fact that the working lives of artists, particularly those who try to live in a place like New York, are precarious. And so this is a much bigger conversation that Occupy Museums and its subsidiary Debt Fair are part of, and which speak really directly to the working lives of the members of the group and to many people they're affiliated with. Now, one of the other big themes I want to deal with here, and this is also, there's some information, there's websites and readings on your handout for all of this if you want to follow up with anything. Of course, a lot of what's out there now is in the form of articles that were published online as these events transpired and that have been written since then. I've given you some books that have come out in just the last 2-3 years, attempting to really make some sense of what we've seen in the last, this period of time, less than a decade at this point. But I expect to be seeing a lot more material coming out from art historians, but also scholars of protest and politics, sociologists. I think a lot of work is being done in this field right now to try and situate this work in its historical moment. One of the other major strands in all of this has to do with the Me Too movement and this process that just started in very recent times of a kind of reckoning with the behavior of powerful men. And so this is a very recent show. These are photographs I took of an exhibition by Andrea Bowers, whose work is also in the MFA's collection. She had several pieces in that political intent show that some of you possibly could have seen. Her work has long been addressing, what is she now? She's in her early 50s, so she's been active for quite some time. And her work has always dealt with the history and present day context of political activism. And so some of the works look back to imagery and the culture of activism from the 60s, right on up to the present. And other projects are much more based on what's happening in the immediate moment. And that was this one you're looking at here. You're looking at, on the left, are the windows facing the street. So it has these large plate glass windows. So people walking down this Karl Marx Allee in Berlin could look directly into the space. They had a few office chairs positioned on the floor that you could roll around in order to read the text on these banners. I'll show you it in just a sec. And at the far end of the wall, you see this sign, Trust Women, made out of cardboard and blinking lights. And I'm just showing you two different moments of it because the colors of the letters changed, and it created this little bit like a kind of carnivalesque type of signage. But the bulk of the show, and there were other works in it, consisted of research that she had been doing to try to keep track of the speed of events. Following the, what we can really see as the fall of Harvey Weinstein, numerous other powerful figures were called to task. And that of course consists of people in industry, people in film, people in culture, but also men in the visual arts and architecture. And so she mixed all of these different figures together. By the time of this show, there are 100 banners representing 100 men in this show. But she's also keeping, and I think she's still working on it, an active file of these accounts as they've been published. The accusations, the responses by the men, some of which have been defensive, some of which have been in the context of an apology or something in between. And each banner consists first of the basic, the information as this work first, as the information first came out to the public. So here is one figure much closer, of course, to the art world, Chuck Close, who's been accused by a few of his interns and models, women he's worked with, of having been sexually inappropriate, having made inappropriate comments. He has acknowledged a certain type of, I think he acknowledged his foul mouth, as he put it, but he felt that this was all done in the context of art and a kind of open adult atmosphere where people could maybe not be quite so restrictive. But a number of women have perceived his behavior to be threatening. And so this is just one among many people she has referred to here, giving both press accounts that appeared everywhere from Twitter and Facebook to the mainstream media, and then the responses by the artists themselves. This includes people like Knight Landsman here, you see on the left, who is now a former co-publisher of Art Forum magazine, who likewise was accused by many women in the Art Forum staff of having been inappropriate, of sexual harassment. And so each one begins with a quote by the figure: "I fully recognize that I have tested certain boundaries, etc. However, I'm fully engaged in seeking help to ensure that my behavior with both friends and colleagues is above reproach in the future." And so there's one of the things that's interesting in reading through these is the way each person responds, and this sort of question of the degree of culpability, of admitting something, or of just trying to kind of change the optics, as it were, where you get the sense that the statement was probably written by somebody else and doesn't come across as being particularly genuine. Here on the right, of course, Donald Trump. In his case, no apology has appeared, and so that's made clear as well in the process. Now, this is something that's very much of the moment, and it's a kind of moving target, and I think that's one of the things to keep in mind as we look at these some of these projects, because they're not over yet. There's a momentum behind the Me Too movement right now that is still going. Now we're beginning to see Harvey Weinstein potentially, or as a recent report seemed to indicate, maybe even avoid trial on certain charges. It's a very long contested project, obviously, and she's producing work here that marks a particular moment in time, but also forms the basis for a kind of archival gathering of information. And I think one of the big questions in a project like this, in the art context, is what is this project status as a work of art? This is in a commercial gallery. As far as I know, this work is for sale. And so that needs to be brought into the discussion. Would an institution want to buy this? Who would find this to be collectible? Or is this just a kind of temporary thing that will pass by all too quickly? I think one of the things she's producing is something that is akin to a kind of monument. The scale of it is fairly monumental. It's kind of overwhelming to sit down in these chairs and read these documents from a little bit of a distance, or walk around. They were on the other side of this wall here as well. And so Bauer's, this idea of open secret, something that was known by people and was more or less public in each individual case, speaks to this idea of her first objective simply being to put the information out there, and to do so in a way that's visually compelling and that could be said to link up to other forms of traditional monuments that vertically oriented, bold graphics, ways of conveying information as clearly as possible. You could look also to also a recent project. This just is from last month. It's a very current topic. The Guerrilla Girls, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. This is a group that is, of course, has its history. Poster from 1987. It's a group of women who, like Grand Fury, do not identify themselves as individuals, but rather operate behind these masks. And I think at this point, there's at least a couple generations of women who've been involved with the project, all of which is meant to shed light on gender inequality within the museum and gallery context, going back to the 1980s, especially then at a time where there really were very few women getting major solo shows, certainly in museums and even in galleries. That would, of course, begin to change through the decade of the 80s and right up to the present, but they're still active. And there is still a need to create greater parity in museum institutions. For this project, you see them here in front of the Whitechapel Gallery in London. They were part of a show. They had agreed to be part of a group show that was to be held at the Design Museum. So it was a show about political graphics. And so the title of that show was going to be Hope to Nope. Graphics and Politics, 2008 to 18, so the last decade of political graphics. And it included dozens of artists. They were just one part of the group. But they found out that as the members of the group found out that there was going to be a show at the Design Museum which was related to an international fair for arms dealers. And given the political nature of the graphics exhibition, 30 artists pulled out of the show, including the Guerrilla Girls. And so instead, they mounted a counter show hastily at a place called the Brixton Rec. Sorry, that's where I meant to go. And the counter exhibition, it wasn't just the Guerrilla Girls, it was a number of different people and different groups called From Nope to Hope, Art versus Arms, Oil, and Injustice. And so each of the works took on a particular kind of political inflection, both in relationship to the Design Museum, but of course to much larger cultural issues. And this is where we see another kind of category of institutional critique, and it's this idea of what you might think of as a kind of correction device, that there's this sense that it may be a little bit ironic, a little bit parodic, that the Guerrilla Girls want to help museums do a better job. They want to help provide more accurate, more informative wall labels. They want to help curators make better decisions about creating more equal representation. Here was the project that they showed at the Brixton Rec, and this dealt with specifically Chuck Close, given the recentness of these accusations. And so what they did was they proposed 3 different ways to write a museum wall label when the artist is a sexual predator. This is their language. Based on this painting, this is Chuck Close, portrait of Bill Clinton, the painting's from 2006, based on a photograph from an older photograph that had been on the cover of, I think, New York Magazine. And on these individual wall labels, you have, and this is done, of course, in Chuck Close's inimitable fashion with the photo-based project that he puts into a grid onto the surface and blows up, enlarges, expands the scale. They came up with 3 different versions of wall labels. The one on the left would be for museums afraid of alienating billionaire trustees and collectors who donated the artist's work, and that would be, I'm not sure why they put 1992, because the painted portrait's from 2006. It's in the National Portrait Gallery in DC, but maybe it was based on the photograph that was first used. Chuck Close is one of the most important artists of his generation and the creator of a new kind of portraiture consisting of patterns of color. That's the kind of neutral, positive account of the work. The next one, for museums conflicted about disclosing an artist's abuse next to his art. Chuck Close is one of the most important artists of his generation and the creator of a new kind of portraiture consisting of patterns of color. Same, but adding, like many artists, he has had a few disgruntled employees. So not saying too much, but getting moving in the right direction. And then the one that they advocate, this is for museums who need help. There's that kind of playful, we can help you approach. Portrait of Bill Clinton. Chuck Close has had a huge career with Prices to Match. Now they've left behind the first part of the language. He has been accused of sexually abusing models and students he picked up at fancy art schools. This is where it becomes more comedic, obviously. How fitting and ironic that he painted the official portrait of Bill Clinton. The art world tolerates abuse because it believes art is above it all, and rules don't apply to genius white male artists. Wrong. And that last wrong might bring another more recent president to mind in the age of Twitter. It should be said that all this is taking place in the aftermath of a decision that the National Portrait Gallery made to cancel a show that they had planned of the work of Chuck Close in the aftermath of these charges coming to light, and so, which he was quite upset about for obvious reasons, and he made his own sort of type of apology, but essentially saying he felt that it was in the context of a kind of adult environment that everyone was on the same page. And that's, I think what these events have made us clear about is that people can't assume what the other person's level of comfort is in context, particularly where there's a very obvious power dynamic. And that's really what's playing out in this, in the Me Too movement across the board. Now, so sexual politics, sexual identity being the theme we've just been looking at, and now with the time I have left, I want to talk about the question of race, because a number of the major controversies, and I think you might say perhaps the most emotionally fraught, the most contested kinds of debates have been centered very heavily on race, and I think that's the case for many reasons. Certainly in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and in the wake of the street demonstrations in Ferguson after the death of Michael Brown in 2014. We've seen a whole range of situations in museums and relations between artists and their public playing out, and I'm just going to show you a few of them. Here is one of the earlier ones, because it took place right at this, and by early I'm talking 4 years ago, so this is all within the context of quite recent work. This is, on the right is Joe Scanlon, the artist who's responsible for this project, in conversation with Jennifer Kidwell, an African-American artist who he worked with, along with a couple of other actors, women of color, who played a character that he had invented. And the way this played out over time was that this figure named Donnell Wolford was meant to be a roughly 40-year-old or late 30-something African-American woman artist. And Scanlon wanted to create a fictitious character who could stand in as the maker of his work. And that's precisely what he did for he'd been working on this project for many years, going back to the early 2000s, and had shown it in numerous places where it hadn't received too much negative attention. I think there had been some criticism of it, but not very public attention. But it was when it appeared in the Whitney Biennial, and as we can see, the Whitney Biennial has been a kind of lightning rod for a lot of these discussions, partly because it's showing some of the most kind of cutting-edge, provocative work, just by nature, having the biennial structure in place there. This, on the lower left, you see Jennifer Kidwell playing this figure, Donnell Wolford, as just one of many performances that evolved out of their collaboration. And I should emphasize that for his part, Scanlon sees this as a collaboration, as not him giving directions to the women he works with, but rather the work evolves out of conversations with them. And to repeat, Kidwell herself is an actor rather than a visual artist, and so this is part of her, she sees this more as an acting project. And here you see her on the lower left at a performance around the time of the Whitney Biennial at the Kitchen, a famous long-running performance space in Chelsea, where she is performing Dick's Last Stand, which was her version of the last public performance that Richard Pryor gave, in which he himself played multiple characters. This was in 1977. He played multiple characters and went fluidly in between them, so very much confusing the audience. So there's multiple layers of fictitiousness at play in this project. But part of the controversy centered around this idea of stereotyping and this idea of a white artist sort of making claims through the body, through the work, through the image of a black person, in particular a black woman. It evokes the controversy that it evolved, and I'll talk more about it momentarily. It evokes some of the controversy around Kara Walker's work earlier in the 1990s, an artist whose work is also represented in the MFA. Although, of course, there's a major difference here in that Kara Walker herself is black. She's a black artist, and the debate around her work was how appropriate is it for anyone, even for an artist of color, to make use of images that evoke some of the harshest racial stereotypes that circulate in our country. And what was interesting in some ways about that debate as it played out in the mid-1990s is that it was very much a generational debate, among other things. And within the black community, many of the work's biggest critics were members of an older generation, black artists who had first started showing their work in the 1960s and 70s, who found that to tap into these long-running cultural stereotypes and really quite offensive images in some cases was not healthy, it wasn't productive, and it ran the risk of people simply not understanding the sarcasm, the satire, the irony behind their use. Whereas Walker and a number of her supporters felt that actually by avoiding dealing with these objects, you're prolonging problems. We need to put it out there. The work needs to be seen. The images, the stereotypes need to be addressed directly. Of course, the big difference in this Donnell Wolford case was that it was a white male artist, middle-aged white male artist working with black women actors. And so these are just a cluster of photographs of two of the women he worked with, and he collaborated very closely with two in particular. What was also troubling, and this is where the controversy became a little bit more visible, was the fact that in the Whitney Biennial, his name was actually not listed on the list of artists. Donnell Wolford was listed as if she were a living figure rather than a fictitious character. And this led to a group of artists, predominantly artists of color, known as YAMS, Y-A-M-S, a collective, who had work in the show. Having seen this project by Scanlon, felt that this was just beyond the pale, and they left the exhibition. They chose not to take part. Scanlon's response was that he felt it was a much more of a collaboration. He felt that there was a lot of kind of clear play with historical ideas of inspiration and influence. For instance, the idea actually emerged out of him tinkering around in his studio by making sort of clumsy cubist-like works out of scrap wood and glue, like this one on the right here. Over time, he thought, these are works that look like they want to be made by somebody other than me, and I need to think about who that artist might be. And over time, he started thinking it would be interesting if an artist of color, a woman artist in the second decade, or in the 21st century, I should say, since he worked on this over quite a few years, it would be interesting if this figure took responsibility for the work, or if I gave responsibility to the work. So there were installations like you see here. Explosion in a shingle factory, some of you may know that reference, and that's itself a kind of tongue-in-cheek reference to another famous controversy earlier in the 20th century, so approximately 100 years before he worked on his project. Marcel Duchamp's famous Nude Descending a Staircase second version was displayed in 2013 at the Armory Show in New York to great, the controversy wasn't as emotional in this case. It was really just that people were offended and they felt it wasn't art, that it was ugly, that it was hard to understand. And one critic referred to this as an explosion in a shingle factory, so it's a way of creating a relation, among many other great quips at the time in the popular press. He's trying to create a relationship between the present and the past, but I think his thought process is to say that it's not that interesting for a white male artist, middle-aged at this point in history, to remake that work. It's more interesting for somebody else to do it. And that was the standpoint he came from. But It generated a great deal of controversy. There was a lot written about it. You can look up articles on Hyperallergic. This website in particular published a lot of writing about it, as did many other venues. And the idea, I think, what it comes down to, the critique is that, okay, it might conceptually hold up. It might be interesting, but there's a level of naivete there that is attached to the idea of a white artist presuming to be able in any way, shape, or form to speak to an artist of color. And that's precisely, or speak for, as it were, an artist of color. And that was, or a person of color for that matter. And that was the case as well with another very controversial and very loaded debate around Dana Schutz's painting, Open Casket, which, like that Debt Fair project, appeared in the Whitney Biennial of last year, so in 2017. Schutz, I'll come back to this in just a second, has had a really skyrocketing reputation as a painter going back to the early 2000s and right on up to the present, as a painter who works in the figurative tradition but likes to take these isolated moments, some of them from photographs, many of them very fantastical. I mean, she's got a very wide range of images she makes. This being one of her early works, Sneeze. And this idea of capturing a moment, a moment in time, and particularly a moment that goes by quickly, but a very impactful moment. In the case of this work, Open Casket, she's making reference to this famous photograph of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy who was, as we now know definitively, was falsely accused, a black boy, was falsely accused in 1955 of harassing a white woman in her store and was lynched, brutally lynched when he was 14 years old. This was in 1955 in Mississippi. And I'm sure many of you know the photograph. His mother chose to have an open casket at the funeral so people could see what these white supremacists had done to her son. And she also allowed the photograph of his heavily battered body to circulate in public. And I'm choosing not to show that photograph because I think it's already enough to show this painting. I think one of the, just incidentally as an aside, but I think an important one, is that all of these controversies, when we talk about them in public, it puts a question on the speaker to say, what do I show? In this case, it might be more thorough if I showed you the photograph of Emmett Till, but I feel that it's actually unnecessary because it's an image that's widely known, and it's an image that anybody can look up anytime online, and it might in fact really upset some people because it is that brutal and gory. Now, this painting that she produced is based on the photograph which is taken from above the casket and focuses predominantly on his disfigured face. And so that's in the photograph as well as in the painting. And like she does with a lot of her work, there's this kind of play between elements of abstraction, like you might see here in the lower left, where that sneeze becomes very materialized and painterly, and it seems to be as much about painterly gesture as it is about capturing the material flying through the air, this material that disappears fairly quickly. This too speaks about the relationship between abstraction and figuration and how that relationship is often quite fraught and problematic. It needs to be also said, if you didn't already know, she is white, and that was, of course, part of the problem. So when this, part of the problem for many members of the audience of the Whitney Biennial. And so this artist, Parker Bright, an African-American man, was very much bothered by this work when he first saw it. He was visiting New York to see the show, and he came back for several days in a row and spent the entire day, more or less, standing in front of the work, essentially partially blocking it from view, although obviously anybody could walk up and stand next to him and see it. But in order to see it, you had to see it through his body. You have to look past the body of a living black man and also look at the message on the back of his t-shirt, which said Black Death Spectacle. The idea that there's a long history in this country of spectacularizing the violated and brutalized bodies of people of color. This led to all kinds of print material. I won't go into the details there, but it's something that really people took it as a call to protest the work. There were calls from one end of the spectrum, which was essentially to destroy the work. It should be not only removed from the show, but should be physically destroyed. To others saying there needs to be some kind of protest and some kind of response by the museum, but we don't destroy works of art. And there was a lot of debate online about this. Others ended up joining him or replacing Bright in the days that followed, and deliberately standing and actually more effectively, as you see here, blocking this work from view. Schutz herself made a kind of apology publicly. She had not meant to, as she stated, to offend people. The idea was really she was, as a young mother herself, was somebody she felt that she could empathize with the mother of Emmett Till. And at the same time make a work that was about a very impactful image in the public imagination. But many people felt that simply wasn't her right to do so. And it's an unresolved debate. It's a debate that is ongoing. A book just came out about it. It's on your list called Whitewalling, if you're interested. This book covers 3 incidents of racial politics within the art world. The Dana Schutz controversy, and then 2 controversies. One of the late 70s was one of the late 60s in New York. Now, just to show you, this was also, it was located, as you can see here on the right, quite close to the work by Det Fair. So all of this was clustered in one area of the Whitney Biennial. I think I am, are you up there, Kristen? Am I getting close to, is it 12? I want to make sure I'm 12. Okay. I want to save time for questions, so I'm going to just go a little more quickly. I just have a couple more projects. I'll do it in 2 minutes because I want to be able to field some questions. But just these controversies have been playing out in various ways and in various locales. In 2016, it was the white artist Kelly Walker's Black Star Press images for a solo show at the St. Louis Art Museum. He too was interested in this relationship between figuration and abstraction and the fact that these two sometimes come into conflict, just as artists like Art and Language had done in the late 70s, where they're taking what ostensibly is an abstract painting in the style of Jackson Pollock, but embedding a slightly difficult to recognize, but nonetheless visible portrait of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin to pose, create a kind of conflict between Western ideals of individuality and democracy and socialist realism. In this case, the work of Kelly Walker involved photographs from the Civil Rights Movement, 1963, street protests in Birmingham, and overlaid with abstract gestures painted in different milk, dark, and white chocolate to talk about ideas of obscuring the past and ignoring the past, but done with perishable materials. A number of members of the audience, this is St. Louis, where Ferguson is located, took great exception to this work, and despite the fact that the curators couched it and put it into relationship with Andy Warhol's race riot images from the 60s, using the same source images by Charles Moore, a number of people in the Black community felt it hadn't, that it didn't do anything productive with that, and by using chocolate and by many other works in the show were very upsetting. And so the solution for this one was to put a sign up, a warning sign, but keep the show going. It did result, though, in the resignation of the curator of the exhibition. And finally, one more work before I turn to some questions. This is Sam Durant, and this had a different outcome. Sam Durant made a project, American artist, LA-based, has had work on view in Boston not too long ago. Produced this work initially for Documenta 13, you see here, and it's based on 7, it's a set of gallows that you could walk up onto based on 7 historical executions in the United States and elsewhere, but carried out by the US all the way up to Saddam Hussein's hanging. But most problematic for the local context here was the reference to an 1862 mass execution of 38 members of the Dakota tribe ordered by Abraham Lincoln. And this was mounted in the sculpture garden in Minneapolis right next to the Walker Museum. The work was purchased by the Walker, and they erected it as part of the renovation of this space. So you can see it was being installed at a moment where the space was under renovation. Before the park reopened, there were very large-scale protests there, particularly by members of the Dakota community and other Native peoples who came to the Walker to say, we weren't consulted about this. This is deeply upsetting to us. Signs here, $200,000 reward for scalp of artists. Execution is not art. Feels like 1862. Dakota genocide is not art. And what ended up happening here, I won't go into the details, was that the work actually was dismantled and removed. And this was done as a joint decision between the artist himself, who very publicly stated he thought it was the right thing to do, the curator, Olga Viso, who also expressed her remorse. They both publicly apologized. And, of course, by the Dakota people who didn't want to see it there in the first place, and who led a number of days of protest on just outside the chain link fence, blocking off the park. They were ultimately successful, you could say. Sam Durant couched it in the terms of a productive exchange, and that he felt badly that people had been upset and offended and realized he should have gone to them first. But one could see this as a kind of learning opportunity. The fact is the work is still ostensibly in the collection of the Walker. It's hard to say whether it'll ever be rebuilt. It may well not, but it's a kind of educational tool in many ways, but one that caused some people quite a bit of pain. And I think that's been this relationship between inside and outside that I began with is something that in recent years has become really quite fraught, politically loaded, and quite emotional as people have really spoken their mind more publicly and brought curators and museum directors to task. I'm sorry, I went about 5 minutes over. I'll leave it at that and leave us with Amalia Pica here, but I'd be happy to engage you in conversation for a few minutes if we can have them. Thank you.
We have a couple microphones on either side of the room. If you want to raise your hand high. Or if you want to continue discussing amongst yourselves and come down and greet Greg if you have any questions for him in person. Thanks.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Greg.
Have a good one. Thanks.